حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على
صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. الثانية بأعلى أصواتكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، لك الحمد حمدا دائما أبدا، ولك الشكر بجميع محامدك كلها، ثم الصلاة والسلام على خير خلقه أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله الطاهرين وصحبه المنتجبين. اللهم صل على محمد. Praise be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Lord of here and the hereafter. We praise Him, a praise that until the end of time, eternally. And we thank Him for all the blessing that we receive from Him. Convey our greeting and salutation to the Holy Prophet of Islam and his pure progenies. Sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ibadallah, awsikum wa iyai bittaqwa Allah. عن عقيلة بني هاشم زينب سلام الله عليها إنها قالت في جواب سائل سألها: من شيعتكم؟ أهل البيت. إن كنت تعمل بما أمرناك وتنتهي عما زجرناك عنه فأنت من شيعتنا، وإلا فلا. When Zainab Salamullah alayha was asked once by someone to define who is the true follower of Ahlul Bayt, she came up with a very simple formula. If you were to follow our guidelines and stay away from what we have disapproved of, then you are our followers. And if you are not, you are not. Very simple. We start with the reminder. Number one, I would like to ask everyone to turn off their cell phones and refrain from conversation. And number two, since we have today I believe, according to part of history, is the anniversary of birth of Sayyidah Zainab sallallahu alaiha. So I would like to take this opportunity and offer my congratulations to every one of you on this occasion. May Allah grant us the privilege of being true followers of Ahlul Bayt and truly understanding who Zainab was and is, because other people are beginning to understand her better than we are. I would like also to extend my thanks on behalf of everyone at the Islamic Center. Last Saturday, we had fundraising, and both to the volunteers who came to the center and those who contributed. Thank you very much, and may Allah bless you and reward you amply for the contribution. We get to a very critical issue. On Wednesday, the governor declared her new executive order as far as COVID-19. It is serious, sisters and brothers. Pay attention. The numbers are going up, and it's become critical for everyone to pay attention to the hygiene issue, the masks, and everything else, and the social distancing. It doesn't mean that once you enter the center, then you can violate everything and start getting close. It is a serious issue. Today also is the 85th anniversary of one of the earlier mujahideen during the British occupation of Palestine. Sheikh Ibrahim al-Qassam, that was killed by the British, a Syrian scholar that was killed by the British 85 years ago. So we would like to ask everyone to recite Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The anniversary of the birth of Zainab Salamullah alayha, the second most important figure in the story of Karbala, in the uprising against the tyranny of Bani Umayyah. We normally, culturally and traditionally best remember her and as purely within the context of Ashura and Karbala, nothing more, nothing less. We hold her to be the central figure in the uprising of Karbala, and in most of the oration and Usbu' commemoration and so on, we see the name of Zainab being mentioned and recited, even repeatedly, as long as you can get some people to cry for the tragedy of the story of Karbala. So the role that we recognize and remember Zainab Salamullah alayha is very limited scope within the Karbala uprising purely. And the literature doesn't go beyond that. If you research as far as the life, this unique character that encapsulates, starting from the life of the Holy Prophet, close to 6 years, 5 years with the Holy Prophet, few months with her mother Fatima al-Zahra salamullah alayha, and witnessing the tragedy of what happened to her. Then we have Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah salam alayhi during his life, the life of Imam Hassan, the life of Imam Hussein. She encapsulates the essence of everything, but yet if we search in our literature, we hardly find adequate literature that explains about her life before Karbala or what happened after. We encapsulate her purely within this limited scope, and the only thing left for her would be to become a saint, and we ask for shafa. If you look at it, it's purely the death of Imam Hussein, the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, led to the captivation of the women and Ahlul Bayt, and they did nothing but wept and mourned and humiliated and witnessed the cruelty of Yazid in Sham. That's it, nothing more and nothing less. But recently we are beginning to see some changes taking place, both within the Muslim community and non-Muslim community within the academia. Particularly what we call women or gender studies are focusing on the role of Zainab and Fatima al-Zahra as two leading figures of the early history of Islam. And what is interesting, fortunately, in this discourse is that they remove these individuals from purely tragic scope that we traditionally have encapsulated them. And they are trying to look at them as individuals that with courage, strength, charisma, that if it wasn't for the role that they played during the early history of Islam, the whole history of Islam would have changed. Karbala certainly is dependent on Zainab, because after the demise and the martyrdom of Imam Hussein salawatullah salam alayhi on the 10th of Ashura, the second figure here that took the responsibility of taking the message of Ahlul Bayt to Sham, it was Zainab salamullah alayha with the rest of the female families within Ahlul Bayt. Nobody else. Yes, certainly by the time they got to Sham, Imam Zain al-Abidin had a role to play in it as well, but the primary and the central figure here was Zainab salamullah alayha. Our enemies understand the role of Zainab far better than we do. If we purely encapsulate her within tragic life and weeping and crying and so on, there is a story which is now known by everyone. When Marhum Shaheed Sadr, Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr was, Saddam took him and his sister Bint al-Huda to Baghdad and ultimately martyred Shaheed Sadr. After the occupation of Iraq and the fall of Baghdad and ultimately coming up like a rat from a hole, Saddam, he was interviewed by a number of Iraqi figures. And somebody asked him, let us assume Marhum Shaheed Sadr was a political enemy. What's that got to do with Zainab? I mean, with his sister, Bint al-Huda. The response clearly states how even up to today, the Wahhabi mindset and even the tyrants are afraid of a female character that is capable, has the charisma and the knowledge to be able to play a major role in guiding society. His answer was, I didn't want a second Zainab in our community. When the Wahhabis started destruction of Syria, they focused on Zainab salamullah alayha, number one. Why? Because so long as the mausoleum exists, she becomes the embodiment and her mausoleum becomes the beacon for everything else that happened in history of Islam that for one reason or the other, it was brushed under the carpet. That we will not leave anything. If you go back to 2011, 2012, and particularly around 2013, when the mercenaries were granted the privileges of training and everything else, the goal was Sayyidah Zainab. Everything else was secondary. So these scholars, both male and female, some of them are non-Muslim, that focus on the concept of female or gender studies in Islam and the role of women in the early history of Islam and how critical and charismatic the role of these individuals were. They focus on two characters, Fatima al-Zahra salamullah alayha, but specifically try to analyze Khutbah al-Fadakiyya, and on Sayyidah Zainab salamullah alayha and her speeches in Kufa and Sham in front of Yazid. Interesting analogy that they come out. They say rather than focus on the tragic part, undeniable, it was part of the whole experience. But the concept of jihad for male and female within Islam is slightly different. The male has to defend. Occasionally, they might be necessary for the female to come when it becomes critical and participate in battle. But technically, the jihad that these scholars focus upon, they say, Imam Hussein had a jihad, combat, to fight Bani Umayyah physically. But his sister and the ladies within Ahlul Bayt, they had a responsibility of jihad as well. And they relied on the advantages that they had, the charisma, the status, and the knowledge, the intellectual capability that far exceeded what Yazid or Bani Umayyah or anybody else, or Ibn Ziyad or anybody else can offer. This is when she starts the sermon in Kufa, Ya Ahl al-Kufa. The rings, the sound is Amirul Mu'mineen. This is a sign of a charisma. It's not a sign of a person that is torn to pieces and weeping and so on. She knew exactly her role, what she is supposed to do. So it is unfair for us to purely, this is the critique that gender study now these days have about the traditional or classical approach to understanding Zainab's life and Fatima al-Zahra's life. And they were determined, Fatima al-Zahra salamullah alayha was determined to expose the tribal mindset that came to dictate the life of the Muslims after the demise of the Holy Prophet. أفي كتاب الله يا ابن أبي قحافة أن ترث أباك ولا أرث أبي. This is well known. What is the rationale here? You are going back to the tribal mentality of Jahiliyyah. In the same manner, we have Zainab salamullah alayha stands in front of Yazid, the so-called Khalifatul Muslimin, and says, if it wasn't for the turn of event, you are very low in front of my eyes. You are not the person that I should be speaking to. They clearly understand the responsibilities. Fatima al-Zahra exposed that. Zainab salamullah alayha exposes the Bani Umayyah cultural mindset. So they focus on the notion of retelling the story of Karbala and removing that traditional issue, traditional and classical interpretation of purely tragic, removing it. And re-engaging the literature and saying, no, there is much more things that we have missed about the life of Fatima al-Zahra and Zainab salamullah alayha. It's refreshing to see that it's coming from non-Muslims rather than the traditional Muslim scholars that try to avoid coming out of that cocoon that we have constructed around their life. They say that just look at the charisma of Sayyidah Zainab salamullah alayha. The single hadith that I began the sermon with it, she has stated it, and the rest of the Imams after have either copied it or they have said something close to it. If you want to be the Shia and the followers of Ahlul Bayt, it's not complicated. The formula is very simple. Submit to the command of Allah and stay away from the prohibition. Simple. There is no complication about it. The basis for any spiritual development starts from here. As long as you commit the sins and at the same time yo-yo back to submitting to the command of Allah, forget about the spiritual journeys. The basic formula for